I'm reading my presentation today. Thank you for having me as Keynote and to Phil and Tess for organizing this event. To queer or not to queer, that is the question. I would first like to stress the relevance of using queer approaches to examining the digital, or seen through the lens of my research interest. What can such approaches offer geographers to examine how the lives and experiences of sexual and gender minorities, in particular LGBT populations, are expressed through digital spaces? Queer approaches can be relevant to any type of geographical inquiry, and I argue that queer approaches are helpful in questioning or queering norms and forms. I respectively refer to identity norms, notably heteronormativity, and the makeup of such norms through objects and their manifold representations. In this context, second, I would like to highlight the relevance of studying public art, broadly defined as artworks situated in spaces that are publicly accessible and that integrate emerging digital contexts too. Regarding both time and space, public art is a dynamic concept as well as a field of practice. It ranges from material statues made by elite artists for the street, such as white male heroes riding horses to symbolize national pride, to digital mashups made by, in brackets, amateur publics, which are packaged in tweets for audiences that are as widely distributed as the World Wide Web. Such mashups can coexist with material artworks that they draw on. And digital overlayering, in this sense, operates as ekphrasis in digital space, or in other words, a rhetorical or imagined add-on that can reveal a counter story. Some geographical locations are safer than others to do this. Voicing difference via the digital can be profoundly empowering for people who are typically invisibilized or even oppressed in offline realities. In other words, the digital can provide a safe and sometimes anonymous action space to render alternatives, and thereby elicit a repertoire of different practices and understandings that emerge from the same object that is subject to critique, and reach far beyond the intent of the original maker and dominant public reception. After Sarah Ahmed's queer feminology, queer theory requires ongoing orientations or, quote, processes of alignment between space, object, and body, where I might argue that, quote, lines disappear through such processes of alignment, so that when one thing comes, quote, out of line with another thing, the, quote, general effect is, quote, wonky or even, quote, queer. The creation of public art and its mutation through digital alterations in the often highly politicized realm of social media calls for continuous reorientations, not only of the conceptual lines or borders, if you will, between materiality, digitality, and identity, but also of the political powers that shape them in digital practice and complex in-between spaces that deconstruct binaries such as we versus them, here versus there, the material versus the intangible, the public versus private, the human versus non-human, and so on and so forth. And such spaces are intrinsically incoherent and messy. In this context, Jason Luger and myself simultaneously pursued digital public art as politics and as an agent in politicizing online public spaces, which we described in a Progress Human Geography piece a few years ago. And this may uncover feelings of togetherness, but also deep fracturedness, this process. Encountering public art through the digital in a way produces contact zones 2.0, which can be highly antagonizing. I proceed with an example from my AHRC project Queer Memorials, recently published in the journal Homosexuality, to discuss how an LGBT-associated public artwork destroyed by far-right opposition virtually lived on. The artwork in question is called Tęcza, which is Polish for rainbow, and it's depicted in my background. It was made by Julita Wojciech in collaboration with members of the community. The large structure was first located in front of the EU Commission building in 2011 in honor of Poland's EU presidency. It moved to the middle of the busy roundabout in Xavier Square in Warsaw city center, where it suffered the fate of 7 arson attempts. City authorities eventually removed it in 2015. Tęcza was, to use Ahmed's phrase, quote, out of line. With a dominant climate of religious conservatism in a country that is facing rising levels of ethno-nationalism and far-right opposition to LGBT rights and visibility. But its story is profoundly wonky, seeing that the practices and discourses surrounding it have been ambivalent and antagonistic, and that offline and online actions have been in a continuous feedback loop between reactionism versus progressivism. The artist wanted to give expression to abstract values such as joy, hope, and love. In an interview with the New York Times, Wojciech conveyed that the rainbow, in light of Poland's reputation as, quote, homophobic country, promoted that, quote, we're not closed, but open-minded. While the artist acknowledged Tęcza's reference to, quote, movement on behalf of the emancipation of sexual minorities, unquote, the artist initially denied this connection. At the same time, Wojciech imparted that the rainbow figure may symbolize the covenant between God and humankind, indeed heightened by Tęcza's proximity to the holiest Savior Square church depicted in the background, which would perhaps sound favorable to religiously conservative parties. However, along with far-right and even neo-fascist echelons of the Polish society, they expressed umbrage against Tęcza, both offline and online. This large, hyper-visible artwork associated with the LGBT pride flag, situated next to the holiest Savior Church, was rather read by them as homosexual propaganda imported by, quote, the West, allegedly insulting Polish national and Catholic values. Far-right nationalists facilitated a notable arson attack against Tęcza during National Independence Day demonstrations on 11 November 2013. And this was followed by a kiss-in demonstration under the surviving remnants of the structure a few days later. After its final removal in 2015, Tęcza arrived at its afterlife, so to speak. After Jacques Derrida's spectrology, the reappropriations of Tęcza beyond its material lifetime indicate how this artwork has lived on through a so-called ghost effect. Notably, Tęcza was translated into a so-called unbreakable water hologram installation on the eve of the Warsaw Equality Parade in 2018, which were all events that received much traction on social media. Although the artist did not originally conceive Tęcza as an LGBT monument, it has reignited the debate about LGBT rights in Poland. According to Poland's major cultural web portal, culture.pl, it has become, quote, one of the symbols of Warsaw and a part of national discourse, unquote. Tęcza's temporal materiality has left a footprint on the public's imaginary. The various conflicting appropriations of Tęcza have demonstrated that it has not merely been a fleeting bystander. Material monuments and enactments in the digital can have lasting rhetorical impacts on queer public memory. Weronika Plińska, in her anthropological study on Tęcza, argued that this artwork manifested itself as a free gift after Roger Sansi. However, a public artwork that became converted into a disobedient object, quote, a sort of anti-monument used by ordinary people to exert counterpower. Relocation of Tęcza to a public site is still under debate. Its virtual footprint still fires the public imagination, stretching beyond Teng Xue's original site and alluding to highly polarized attitudes and political agendas. The journeying of this artwork through social networks and media turned this art piece into a networked monument of the ongoing struggle for LGBT visibility and rights in Poland. In conclusion, the Teng Xue story reveals how a public artwork has become queer. It embodies an anti-normative rhythm, disrupting the patronage of much permanent and white heteronormative statues. It also speaks to the fleeting yet subversive character of queer spaces. That is to say, the discourse and practices that have emerged around Teng Xue have come to query heteronormative boundaries as much as the boundaries between the material and post-material, including digital legacies of public art. Queer is, too, a radical transdisciplinary project, a form of scholarly activism to challenge social norms, to pursue alliances with the oppressed beyond sexual and gender identity alone, and to create a safe space to express that there would be no queer collegiality without intersectional solidarity. Thanks.